All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our office hours. You are here for our office hours on stress, behavior, and the brain. And we have a fantastic guest speaker today. We have Bear Shea joining us to present. Let's see. We are recording this training, so there will be a recording available for anybody who's not able to attend that would like to. It will be put up on our website as soon as it's ready. It takes usually a couple of weeks to get that done, but it will go on the website. Carly has just dropped two links to the PowerPoint in the chat box, so you guys can have access to that. That will also be uploaded to the website after this training. Let's see, making sure I'm getting all of the waiting room. Okay, let's see. So here's our agenda today. I'm going to do brief introductions for the supervision, monitoring, and support team, who are the hosts of this office hours. Then I'm going to turn you over to Bear Shea for Brain 101. And we will have time for questions at the end. You can drop your questions in the chat if you'd like. I think Bear offered that if you want to come off of chat, you'll be welcome to do that, but I'll leave that for him to tell you. And then we have resources at the end of our PowerPoint for some of our supervision, monitoring, support resources. So here is our team. I'm excited. We have lots of new faces here with us because because of our guest speaker, I think. So these introductions won't sound super familiar to everybody. My name is Ashley Satry. I am one of the members of the supervision, monitoring, and support team. I have joined this team about 2 years ago. And before I was on this team, I was a special education teacher in Maine and in Virginia for 14 years. And with me today from our team is Carly.
Hi, everyone. I am Carly Thibodeau, and I have been with this team for just over 3 years. And before that, I was a teacher for 21 years.
Thanks, Carly. And we also have Jennifer Gleason and Colette Sullivan and Julie Pelletier, who are the other members to round out our team. And they are all just doing things elsewhere today. But thank you again for joining us. I think that's our last slide. Let me see here. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second and stop my sharing and allow Bear to share his presentation.
I think I'll just jump in and talk first, and then I'll start to share so that I'm not just like a tiny little screen off to the side as you look at my title page of my presentation. So yeah, my name is Bear Shea. Good afternoon, everybody. I use he, him pronouns. I am the mental health specialist with the Department of Education. I've been in this position about 6 years or so. The mental health position was originally created really to oversee what mental health was in schools. And that follows mental health professionals. I look to support school counselors, school social workers, school psychologists, our BHPs that are doing mental health support, our BCBAs, really anybody that is looking to support mental health in schools, mental health professionals. I am also your LGBTQIA plus specialist in the department. So if you ever have any questions around supports for LGBTQ staff and students, feel free to reach out to me. I am also your Chapter 33 restraint and seclusion specialist. So if you ever have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. I'm also one of the people that's in charge of truancy. So that's another sort of area of expertise. And then I coordinate the climate culture and resilience team within the Office of School and Student Supports. And on that team are specialists for McKinney-Vento, homeless youth, our migrant education program, and highly mobile students, our SEL, foster care, alternative education, and at least probably a couple other positions that I'm not going to be able to recall. So we really, myself and my team really cover a lot of areas that are really forward facing, involved with schools. We talk with administrators and teachers every day. We're here to be sounding boards on any of these topics, and I'm really happy to be here to support you all. My background, I'm a clinical social worker, and I started work really doing a lot of trauma-focused work with families, and found that working with schools really became the best way to do treatment and support for kids. Getting outside of that 50-minute hour of just sitting across from somebody, but being able to see kids 15 minutes a day or 3 hours a day, depending on what was needed. That was something that was really important to me. And so I became a school counselor. I became a clinical director in public schools. I've worked in day treatment level programs with kids doing nonviolent relationship-based work, restorative work. So all of these mental health pieces for me, integrating those into the everyday life of school for supporting students and staff just seems like a natural fit. And so when this position first opened up, that's how I ended up here. So while my passion is really working with children and family, it's really been my pleasure to really help and support this work at the state level. So I'm happy to actually get to do some training with you all today. And when I was asked to sort of talk about where to start, for me, this Brain 101, while, I would say most of us have some of this training, um, when we're talking about student behavior and we're talking about stress and we're talking about all of the barriers that sort of get in the way of learning for kids, for me, it always comes back to this sort of where the brain is at and how all of our brains respond. And so I always want to start there. Even when I'm doing, some of the heaviest trauma therapy, I still start with this Brain 101. I use sort of this same opener when I'm working with, kids that are 6 years old, all the way up to when I'm doing trauma-informed work with adults. Granted, it's sort of served for those age groups, but it is the same core work. So that's what I wanted to share. I really distilled it down to a much smaller version. I've got some longer versions of this training if you're interested, as well as a 201 training that sort of goes into how do you put these things into place? Because I know a lot of the frustration is like, all right, we get it. Like, some of these kids' brains are on fire and they're responding in a primal survival state. I see that. It's obvious. How do we work with it? And so I'm sure we'll get to some of that in the questions, but I do just want to sort of dive in. I'm going to go kind of quickly. So I will take the bulk of questions at the end. Feel free to drop them into the chat. I'm also going to ask for some participation. So I'll ask for participation. You can just drop those into chat too, just to sort of keep it moving. I'm going to cover the two broadest areas, sort of the Brain 101 and then some of the survival responses and then how stress sort of affects the brain. I want to really get those sort of ideas out there so that you can start thinking about them. And that would be any of the work that I would want to do before I got into the actual heavier behavior stuff. So I thought that's what we would jump into. I'm going to do my best to leave time at the end for questions. And if I'm unable, then I'll definitely be available by email if you have other questions. So now let me see if I can actually share this thing. Oh, all right. Can everybody see that? Does that work?
That's perfect, Bear.
Awesome. So like I said, I'm gonna scoot through. I actually can't see the chat now for some reason, which is too bad. So if there are questions in the chat that seem really pertinent, I can answer them if someone gives me a heads up. Otherwise, I'll catch them at the end. Like I said, you'll see some slides that are from a larger presentation. So if you see things in there that I don't cover, like a lot of the things on the right-hand side there, don't worry. I do want to talk just the brain as a unit, all of the things that it does. I think sometimes we forget that our brain is sort of covering all of these different things for us. When we talk about like our emotional status, how we're doing, what we're feeling, what are the thoughts that are running through our head? I'm sure a lot of you had a lot of other things that were going on rather than just coming to this presentation and wondering if it's going to be worthwhile. That's that prefrontal cortex right in the front of our head that is sort of thinking and processing. We also have our sort of hindbrain, which is in the back, which we'll talk more about. And then we have cortical and limbic systems, which govern how our different the chemicals in our body flow and how our sort of responses go. I'm sure some of you have heard about that. There's been a lot of really good research in behavior and emotional sort of regulation and with our cortical and limbic systems. So I'm not going to talk about those too much today, but I do want to talk about just basically the billions of brain cells that we have, and that they're designed to create connections with each other, and that the better those connections are, the stronger that they are, the easier it is for us to do things. And that the brain is interested in making these connections really regarding to its own survival, right? So everything we're doing really has this edge of, am I going to be able to get through to the next day? And so those are some of the pieces that we're going to talk about, but I really want to focus on that efficiency, right? That the brain is going to prune out things that aren't efficient and really try to focus on the most efficient pathways. This is something I would go into depth quite a bit more, but I'm going to skip for another time. So if you're interested in that, definitely feel free to reach out. I can share with you some of those trainings. What I do want to talk about are sort of some of those major structures that come into play when we're talking about stress and we're talking about survival response. When we think about our brains, this is often the picture that sort of comes to mind. I try to find something. I used to draw this on the board, and the pictures that would come out afterwards, I think, were nightmare fuel. So I'm hoping that this is less of that. The first part I mentioned, so that prefrontal cortex right here, you could sort of put your hand like you're taking your temperature, to make sure that you don't have a fever. That's who we are. We are a set of few animals that have a prefrontal cortex as developed. Think about chimpanzees, dolphins. It's really that sort of ability to plan, to enact things, to think through and process, to stop and take time. It also is sort of who we are. This is the part of our brain that really describes who we are. So all of that planning, that forethought, the rational piece of us is really in that prefrontal cortex. The other part that's really important for this conversation is what's called the hindbrain. Sometimes it's called the lizard brain, the mammalian. There's all these terms for it. I like to use hindbrain. And if you take your middle finger and your thumb and you sort of reach back, there are those two sort of knobs on the back of your skull. And that's where your hindbrain sits. So right where your spinal column meets the base of your skull. And this hindbrain is really important. All animals have it. It's where all of our primal memories are stored. So those things that we react to automatically, our instincts, come from this part of our brain. So everything from our latching instinct when we're an infant, to how we respond to stimulus, which we're going to talk about a lot. This part of our brain is really core to that. So those are really the big structures we're going to talk about. There is a little structure that I want to talk about called the amygdala. And the amygdala sits right in sort of the center where the hindbrain meets the rest of the brain. There's a really good model from Dan Siegel. I don't know if you've seen it, but if you take your thumb and tuck it, oh, I'm going to get blocked out here. Tuck in like this, and then curl your fingers over. So here's your prefrontal cortex. Your hindbrain sits on the top of your spinal cord, and inside is the amygdala. All right. So the amygdala has a really cool job. Its job is to constantly assess what's going on, to be sort of like a radar system that sweeps around us constantly and takes this information, brings it in, and decides whether or not there's a threat. So this system is built to keep us alive. So it sits sort of right in that middle, and it's like this alarm, essentially. And the way that works is that it has this ability. So if we see a threat, so if something's coming in, let's say you're walking through a park, and you hear like the crack of a bat, right? And you look up and you see this round object spinning towards you. Your prefrontal cortex, right, starts to assess what's going on. It's like, oh, there's a sphere coming at me. It's rotating counterclockwise. It has red laces. The amygdala fires off And its first job is to decide what that threat is, right? The interesting thing is that the prefrontal cortex takes time to assess, right? Its job is to sort of logically think about it, make a plan, right? Sort of assess things in time, but it is not the most efficient system. And so if we really need to get out of the way, the amygdala will actually turn that part off because it's slow. So this means that all of that thinking, all of that who we are, the planning, the logical part of our brain, because it's slow, goes off, goes dark. They've done these really great studies where they hook brains up to these neural scanners, and then they flash pictures up in front of them. So you'll see like, somebody will be looking at like a beautiful landscape and a sunny day and a field with flowers, and then they'll flash up really quickly like a dog in full frothing attack mode. And you can watch the amygdala fire. You can watch the whole prefrontal cortex go dark, like a movie when the power goes out in a city. And then the hindbrain fires on, right? And the hindbrain's job is around that instinctual survival. This is the part that doesn't need to think. It doesn't need to process. It just reacts, right? So sometimes, and you've probably been in other situations where something is coming at you and maybe you catch it out of the corner of your eye and you move out of the way, or you reach up and catch it, or you dodge, right? So not having that prefrontal cortex on actually saves you in that situation. And that's where that is developed from, is to literally save our lives. So when the amygdala senses threat, it turns off the prefrontal cortex, it fires the hindbrain and allows us to escape, right? Does that sort of make sense? Any questions from the comments?
Nothing in the chat yet, Bear.
Excellent. See, I explained it so well, just makes it easy. Great. So let's talk about survival. This is one of my favorite sort of things to geek out about the brain. I find it super fascinating. I've been studying this for probably almost 15 years now. And I've sort of distilled it down and borrowed from other people that also do this work. But essentially, for me, there's 4 types of survival. All of our reactions, all of our responses boil down into 4 categories. So I'm just going to quickly go through those because they kind of give us the basis for why this is even important when we're talking about working with kids, or honestly, adults too, because we all have brains, right? So let's go with the first. The first couple are the ones we hear about all the time. They're in sort of the common lexicon, and they're the most obvious, right? So let's talk about the fight response. So when we think about fight, can somebody put in the chat some animals that exhibit a fight response when they're threatened? So not to get food, not to, to show off, but when they are threatened, they automatically turn around and fight. I wonder if I can see the chat.
I was going to say, we've got some responses. We've got
awesome. I think I
dogs,
can.
snakes, bears,
Yeah. Bear, really?
cats.
We had to go there, huh? Okay, that's fine. I won't take it personally. Yeah, one of my favorite examples, and this may come from personal experience. Have you ever seen like a chihuahua get cornered? Or you just think it's so cute and you reach down to pick it up and it turns into this frothing death machine? Um, right? Like it is something that I absolutely could pick up and overpower, and yet it makes it so that there's no way I would ever want to touch it, right? And so that's the fight. It's not actually, it never came in contact with me, but the display, right? The display of fight, like you mess with me, it's going to be over. That is enough to keep me from touching it and for it to survive, right? So that's how fight is a survival mechanism. It doesn't have to literally be, I'm going to actually win the fight. It can be this huge display so that you don't even want to mess with me. So let's go to the other part that comes up a lot. Let's see if I can switch screens here. Yay. Flight. So flight is a little more obvious. Again, we hear about fight or flight a lot. What are some animals that when they're surviving, exhibit flight as a survival skill? Birds are actually a really good one, even though fight is also a good one for birds. Deer, right? Absolutely. Horses. Goats. Yeah. So goats is a really, and we'll talk about this one when we get to some of the other methods too. But yeah, that taking off, right? Like I am faster than you, and so I am going to get away. That's how I'm going to stay alive. Um, so you can't catch me. I will outrun you. I will outlast you. I will literally get out of the way so that you can't get me. And that's how you survive, right? Cats and mice, right? A mouse isn't going to sit there and turn around and fight a cat, right? Although you may see it sometimes. And the whole idea of like a rat being cornered is one of the most dangerous things comes from that, like, all right, if I can't run away, then I'm going to turn and fight. So it's using that as a survival method. So when we see that fight or flight, we can they have a similar reaction in our body. So in fight or flight, we have our heart rate increases. We get this burst of adrenaline in our bodies. Our muscles tighten. We sort of scrunch. We're like, we get into this big tight pattern in our bodies. Our temperature rises a little bit. All of the blood moves from around our organs out to our extremities so that it's oxygenated and that we actually are stronger in that moment in addition to the adrenaline. And it's there to protect us. It's there to move our bodies out or to defend ourselves. So that's the point. That is why fight or flight are survival methods. What it looks like in our students, or honestly in anybody, stomping, pacing, breaking things, rants, running away, right? Literally trying to elope or flight. We also see poor decision making, right? As that prefrontal cortex goes dark, we see less rationality and more of that primal response. And that's what we're going to see from all of our 4 survival methods. We might see some suicidal thoughts in fight or flight. Response to interventions, right? When we go to intervene in that situation and someone is in that survival state, we're going to see a reduced ability to engage in cognitive discussions, right? Giving somebody options when their prefrontal cortex is turned off and they're in that survival state, they're not going to be able to rationalize because they're not in their rational brain. It's literally turned off. We will see people doing anything to get out of a conversation, right? And sometimes that might be literally trying to run away. It might be putting on a big display. And when they're getting support, right? It's going to be actively avoiding positive peers. It's going to be trying to get away. It might be increasing the behavior. Someone is coming at me to try to help. And in my dysregulated brain, it actually looks like, I want to be left alone and they're coming at me. And so I might increase my behavior, right? Um, so that's fight or flight. If we think about it as a coin, fight or flight is heads, and the other two are tails. And so they're part of the same coin, but they are on the opposite side. We hear about fight, flight, and freeze a lot. I know it's something that's been in other trainings that we've done. But so freeze is the third. Let's see if I can get back to my chat. There we go. So freeze is the third survival method. Can someone give me an example of when an animal uses freeze to survive? Possum's a great one, right? So they freeze and lock down. Fish. What else we got? Somebody else have any? Yeah, deer, right? And this is like perfect for Maine when I do this training in other states. They don't necessarily understand this. Like the idea that a deer both uses flight to run, but then we're traveling at 65 miles an hour down the highway and they're standing there looking at us and they're like, oh, maybe if I don't move, I won't get hit by this gigantic death machine. So again, that freeze part is part of their brain reacting in the only way they know how, which is to freeze. If we think about animals that use camouflage, that is the survival pieces. And in order to let their camouflage work, they need to not be moving. So baby deer will often freeze and rely on that camouflage. That's why they have a different pattern because they can't outrun certain animals like wolves, dogs, they can run down a deer. And so freezing is just as important of a survival skill as the running. So that's a really good sort of example. Turtle, that idea of like pulling in is a really good like physical sort of reminder. It's like, all right, I'm just going to pull everything in. I'm going to freeze. I'm not going to try to run away. You can knock me all over the place and I'm going to be fine. I love that someone said the fainting goats, because this is actually the perfect example. If you haven't seen the videos of fainting goats, just Google it. And basically, like, through a breeding process, they noticed that this trait was coming up a lot in goats, where somebody would go out and like clap their hands or yell really loudly, and the goats would go to run away and they would literally lock up. Like, their little legs would lock up and they would fall over. And freeze and actually get stuck. And then in a few seconds, they would sort of come out of it. But that's how ingrained that brain response is, that it becomes like, in order to survive, my brain's going to take over and lock down and freeze. The way we see it in kids, in people, putting heads down, pulling hoods down, that pulling in action, retreating, trying to fly under the radar, is really part of that. And then really that hiding piece is how freeze looks like in people. So let's talk about the fourth one. I think it's the one that most people haven't heard about. And it's sometimes difficult to explain. Let's see here. Jump back over here. So submit is the fourth survival method. Can somebody think of, so submit is giving over, is sort of allowing something to happen in order to survive. I'm giving in, I'm submitting when there is something that is happening in order to survive. Can someone think of an animal that does that? We mentioned one earlier. Yeah, dogs will submit and roll over. Yeah. The possum is really, truly, it's less freezing and more about submitting and making itself look like it is completely unwanted, right? It changes itself, it changes its smell, it lowers its heart rate, it appears dead, right? It sort of goes beyond freezing. It's, I'm giving over, giving over and rolling, and literally like pretending dead. I noticed, so Autumn, so there is a movement to call it fawn. And it's nice and alliterative with 4 Fs. I think fawn is a tough term, because fawn can be to fawn over somebody, as in to sort of get out of something, which can also be a part of how humans submit. Um, and that fawn response is also to sort of hide and freeze. I just find it isn't accurate, and it's a tough topic. And so I use submit as a term, because it really is about giving over. This is where our ability to side with, this is like where the Stockholm syndrome comes from, where somebody is siding with their attacker, where they are a victim, and they end up siding with their attacker and commiserating with their attacker because that helps them survive. So for people, it is giving over in some of the worst, most deadly and dangerous situations so that they survive. It can also look like our kids that are rule followers, right? Where as long as I follow the rules and I do exactly what is said and I meet that minimum thing, then no one's going to notice me, right? If I stick out by not following these rules, then that is dangerous. And so I will be in that survival space. So that's what submit is. It's making sure that things are done correctly. Any questions about submit? Because I know it's a weird, sort of complicated one. Think about if someone is trying to harm you and fight doesn't work and you can't flee, and yet freeze is also dangerous, right? Sometimes going along with what that person is asking you to do is sort of not, yeah, enforcing you to do, becomes the way to survive. And in order to do that, it still has to be from a sort of that survival space. It's not a logical thing. You're not thinking in that situation. You're responding by this giving over and giving in and just letting these things happen so that you can live through it. That sort of makes sense?
Nothing in the chat yet specifically about that.
It's a complicated one. The more that I've sort of allowed it to percolate and to talk with people, I think the more that it makes sense. Particularly when we think about how our bodies respond. So whereas fight or flight was sort of the big energy, right? It's the adrenaline rushing in, it's blood filling our veins, it's feeling strong and powerful, being ready physically to run or to fight. Freeze and submit is the opposite. So the blood actually leaves our extremities. It cools around our organs to protect our organs. It turns off, and actually both, I should say, both fight or flight and freeze or submit turn off any of our body's long-term processes. So it turns off your digestion because it's not worried about your energy, whether you're going to survive tomorrow. It's about surviving right now. It turns off other long-term processes like your reproductive system. It impacts how you make and rebuild cells in your body. Essentially, your brain is stealing the energy from all of those long-term processes to survive in the moment. And so we see in freeze or submit that pulling in, feeling like the extremities are cool. We see sometimes people not being able to see in extreme search situations, and really just that sort of narrowing of their entire field in order to survive. So freeze or submit, what we see, what it looks like when we're working with kids or adults, non-responsive or yes and no answers or agreeing to anything said, right? Just to survive, just to get through isolation, excessive sleeping, self-harm and suicidal thoughts. And then response to intervention. So when we are trying to work with someone that is in that dysregulated state, we'll see an increased dysregulation, maybe being emotionally flat, maybe even just shut down and fall asleep. And sometimes it might be a shift into fight or flight. So we'll see that shift moving into other survival mechanisms if this one isn't working. And then in responses to support, when we're trying to offer support to people that are in that survival space, we'll see people opting out of things, agreeing to everything that is said, but then not engaging, being maybe emotionally flat or unavailable. And so all four of these survival methods come into play when the brain is feeling like it's threatened. So when that amygdala fires off and sees threat or perceives threat, these are what we would expect to see. And what happens is the more that amygdala becomes threatened or feels threatened, the higher sensitivity that it has. And because the brain needs to be super efficient, where somebody might have grown up in a place where maybe things weren't very safe, or they're constantly experiencing things that aren't safe, it means that their amygdala is that much more heightened, and so they're more likely to identify things as a threat than if they had been in a safe space. And so we'll see that people who have experienced more situations that are threatening, where their amygdala will be at a more automatic response. It's sort of like those fainting goats. Like the more that our brains learn that that is the way to survive. And let's be clear, the survival mechanisms aren't bad things. They have allowed us to survive this long. They work, right? As far as the brain's concerned, because the brain isn't thinking about the long-term consequences. It's thinking about surviving in that moment because it's the hindbrain, not the rational part of our brain. A good way to think about this, and the way that I talk about it with people, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I do want to show it, is think about fight or flight, from a 1 to 10, and that the closer you get to 10, the more hindbrain you are, and the less frontal cortex is online, the less whole brain you have, so the less ability you have to rationalize. And then freeze or submit would be at a -1 to -10. That means that sometimes we're working with a kid who's maybe at a 5 and swearing and, showing a lot of that fight piece. And then when we do an intervention, that fight, they know that fight or flight isn't going to work. Their brain does. And so it switches down to a freeze or submit. And so, we could say like, hey, if you don't change this behavior, I'm going to call home. And calling home for that child might elicit a really significant survival response. And so they go into freeze or submit and they're like, no, I'll do whatever you ask me to. I will sit down at this desk and do my homework. Look, I'm doing it. Now, to some people, they might think like, oh, great, I've fixed this. This child is no longer swearing and, doing this really extreme fight behavior. Look, they're sitting down and doing their work. Obviously, child has calmed down and I have, de-escalated the situation. But really, all that's happened is the child has gone from a 5 dysregulation to a -5 dysregulation into submit. So it hasn't actually changed where their dysregulation is at. So they might walk out into the hallway and have a friend be like, hey, what's up? And like punch them on the shoulder and they might explode, right? Because they're still in that dysregulated space. All right. I'm going to just take a pause there before we move into the next piece. I'm going to check my time. All right. I don't have a ton of time left. Questions, ideas, thoughts about this and the way it sort of works as far as how that primal response connects with student behavior or even sometimes our own behavior, right? One thing I would not recommend is to go to your partner tonight and be like, I don't know, honey, it looks like you're more at like a 4, maybe we could bring it down. Like, don't do that. That's not going to help. But you will notice it in people. And some people are more likely to be in fight or flight or more likely to be in freeze or submit. Their brain is sort of already keyed that way by the sort of experiences that they've had up to this point. So what I would say is if this makes sense, if there aren't any sort of massive questions or like, what the heck is this guy saying? I'm going to move on to the next piece. And then otherwise I'll leave questions to the end because I want to finish this next piece and I'm going to zip through it kind of quick. But it's important as well. So, all right. So let's talk about stress. The interesting thing about stress is that it's relative, right? So when I look at this and I imagine some children I've worked with where they have like, yes, I will heave myself across this gap, no problem. And other students I've worked with would just be horrified that you would ever even think that, right? And so if you were asking somebody like, hey, in order to get to the next place, you have to jump across this gap, the stress that would be put on the individual is going to be different depending on what their experience is, right? So much like the amygdala is informed and heightened by our experiences, stress relativity really comes from that place as well. That sort of makes sense. And I mean, I guess we sort of all know this at a base level. There are things that I like to do that other people don't, and things that people love to do that I don't, that really stress me out. Like public speaking is something stresses me out. And so I've worked with people that are really comfortable with public speaking, and it's something that they really love to do. And their prep is really different than my prep, right? So we all have those things, but it is different person to person, and it's not based on ability. It's not that, oh, I can jump across this, and so I'm able to do it. It means I'm not stressed. We know that there are kids that have the physical ability to do things, and yet the stress response is so high that it might completely make it so that they're not able to make that jump. So I want you to think about, we're coming into winter. What is this, go ahead and put in the chat, what does this image make you think of, right? As the days are getting cooler. You're really looking at those palm fronds. Relaxation, vacation. For me, it's that warmth, right? Like, oh, I look at that picture, I can almost feel that sun. It's like a totally different sun than the one we're having, right? It's interesting because I would say that's what most people say. And almost every time I get this, people also think, like, when I see that picture, this is what I think of, right? And so it really depends even when we're presenting something. I'm going to go back so that people aren't staring at a shark the whole time, but that you can stare at this nice relaxing piece. But once, just because we think something is even relaxing or allows us to feel calm, it may not be that way. And in fact, it might cause stress for somebody else. I don't know how many of you, and this is ironic because I'm a social worker, I hate icebreaker games. I know they're important. I know they work really well, but man, I would choose to run them every single time. I would run somebody else's icebreaker game rather than have to participate myself, right? That stresses me out. And so there are those different things that are sort of other people think are really great and are calming and are ways to connect, and things that might bring somebody's brain into that sort of survival space, right? Knowing I'm going to have to do icebreakers is going to put me into probably a little bit like maybe a -1 or a -2 freeze or submit. It might put somebody else into like a fight or flight space where they're like, I'm going to get out of here as fast as I can. And so figuring that out for ourselves and knowing where our triggers are, and then when we're working with kids, not making assumptions that our triggers are the same or that we even know what the kids' triggers are necessarily. Those surprises can really catch us off guard. And it makes it really tough to talk about when, right? It's impossible to rationalize when we go into that irrational place. And so if we miss it, we're already into that irrational place. So one other piece I just want to talk about quickly is the idea of neural regulation. So this isn't about happy. None of these things that you've heard me say are about emotions, right? You can be angry and upset, and this is something that I often talk about, right? And you can be really angry, and most people would just assume that that's fight or flight. But I don't know if you've ever had a parent that like, they're angry and they're not saying anything about it, and it's this like cold burn. It's almost the worst kind of anger, right? Or you can see jealousy and have jealousy be fight or flight. And then also jealousy be, again, like your response is to shut down and pull in. The other side of it is you can see things like sadness, right? Sadness we would most often associate with freeze or submit. And I know some kids that when they've been super sad have been really reactive and in that fight space. And so we don't want to make that assumption. What we want to have is neural regulation where our whole brain is online. If we just have our primal brain online, we're not able to think about it, right? If we come up to cross a street, and our primal brain is online, we won't ever cross the street because it's dangerous, right? But if we come to that same street and we only have our prefrontal cortex on, we're just going to make a plan and just go for it, right? There's no fear there. And so it's really important to have our whole brain online so that we can balance those things out. So neural regulation, this isn't about feeling happy. This is about having our whole brain online. So even when the hardest, worst things happen, we're staying regulated. That's the goal. All right. Got to the end. I even left a little bit of time. All right. I'm super impressed with myself today. Feeling good. I'm going to stop sharing. So I know right off the bat, this can be a frustrating presentation because it doesn't have a lot of answers. It has a lot of like, oh, like some explanations, some reasons, some ways of looking at situations differently. One of the things I hear most is that, oh, I don't have to take this so personally, right? Like that kid isn't treating me that way because of me. They're treating me that way because of what's going on in my brain, what in their brain. And so that helps depersonalize for some of the work that we have to do. When I'm working with kids or adults that are working on their own behavior and their own reactions, it helps them too. Like, oh, I can see, like, that's not me that's responding. It is that primal space. Why am I responding that way? And is it worth it? Right? Like, are there other ways that I can respond that still allow me to feel safe, but that don't cost me so much in the long term? And that's how we talk about sort of changing things in a sort of therapeutic sense. So I know this doesn't have a lot of answers, and I apologize for that. And I would love to take any questions that you have about this as an idea. Is it something that makes sense? Does it click a little bit when you hear it put together this way? Or are there pieces that I'm missing? And I ask that genuinely because I love to build this presentation out on any parts that I've missed. And feel free to unmic and respond or drop stuff into the chat, whatever you're comfortable with.
Bear, can you see the chat okay?
Mm-hmm. Give me
Okay.
one sec. I had it and I lost it. Oh, there it is. How to guide students to react in a way that doesn't cost them as much, right? So this is like one of the big pieces of work is that when our prefrontal cortex is off, there's no thinking about long-term goals, right? How many times have we had a kid where we're like, we set a like, hey, if you can do this thing by the end of the week, you'll earn this thing. And maybe it works for a little bit, but ultimately it doesn't. I don't know how many kids I've worked with who were never able to go on a field trip because they weren't able to earn sort of the step-by-step things that meant they could go on a field trip. And because when the prefrontal cortex goes off in that time, there's no thought of that field trip. There's no thought of the bigger piece. It is only on survival in the moment. And sometimes like the reaction to that is like, hey, like you're gonna miss out on it. Now you're threatening me, right? The brain thinks that it's being threatened, and so it reacts even bigger. So a lot of the guiding really comes before it gets to that space, which I know is also an annoying response. Like, yes, obviously, if we get kids that to not react that way, then they don't react that way. But I think when we talk about the methods to use when someone's dysregulated, um, and I think we've probably experienced this where certain staff or certain student friends can somehow connect with a kid when they're dysregulated, when they're in that survival brain. Um, the brain is going to, the more dysregulated it is, the closer to 10 or negative 10, the less it sees people, right? The more it just sees threats. Unless it has a really strong relationship with someone that can sort of break through that, where the brain is able to see that person and know that they are on their side, that they're somebody that is safe and supports them. And that's why sometimes we'll see the difference where a child might have a relationship with another adult where they're able to get through when they're dysregulated. And so really relationship building is a core piece, is really getting those brains to understand that we're not the threat, even when things are difficult, even when we're starting to move into that dysregulated space. And there really isn't a 0 to 100. It might move very fast. That brain might move 1 to 10, 1 to negative 1 to negative 10 really quickly. There are ways that we can sort of catch that. Um, and so that survival response really comes down to getting into it early and sort of creating space, which can be really difficult when we're talking about safety in a classroom. There's a reason that I am both the mental health specialist and the Chapter 33 specialist, restraint and seclusion specialist. It's amazing how close those run, unfortunately. And getting kids to react in a way that is safe before we get to the point where we're needing to use emergency interventions. So the best way for safety is really relationship building. And that's both like the studies that I have read and also my professional experience, really taking time to build relationships with kids, so that their brains view us in a different way. And it's interesting because authority works really well for a good amount of time. And we know that authority and using power in a situation is about fear, right? So that's why authority doesn't work once the brain gets into that irrational space, because it's so afraid it's operating out of a safety, out of survival anyway. And so that's, authority works to a certain point, and then the fear actually becomes its own fuel for the brain's survival. Do do do. Yeah, and this is the interesting thing. Like we ask kids what they need when they're dysregulated, but they don't have the ability. And think of us as adults, like how many of us have been in a situation where like we've really been put into a place where we are ourselves in a survival mode, where we're moving into fight or flight. You get cut off in traffic and you see people have these big explosions. And sometimes there's like a little piece of us riding in the back of our heads, and they're like, I can't believe I would say that, or I can't believe that would happen. Thinking about, arguments and disagreements with family or loved ones, where we say things that normally we would never say, but in the heat of that moment, because we are feeling threatened. And it's interesting that like, what do we need? Or that kids are manipulating, that they're using this to manipulate us, when really that survival response doesn't allow us to manipulate. it really is the survival piece saying, I'm going to do this to survive, and this works to survive. So, yes, me doing this thing that allows you to feel manipulated is because it works as a survival mechanism, not because I have this maniacal plan as a manipulator, right? We actually don't have the ability to manipulate when we're in that irrational space. So asking a kid what do they need, they don't know. And the younger the child, right? We know that the prefrontal cortex develops later in life. We keep pushing that date out and out. I'm sure mine is nowhere close to being finished. But we know for our younger kids, they have this feral brain. They have a very small window of rational thinking, right? They're eating mud sometimes and doing stuff that doesn't make sense, throwing themselves off of playground equipment. Um, like those are their rational bubble is very small. So yeah, when they have a reaction where they don't feel they're safe, they're gonna have this big feral reaction. They have no idea what they need. So it is incumbent upon us to provide what is safety for this kid. And that's going to look different for different kids, which is really difficult when we have a classroom of 25 kids and one person that is supposed to navigate all of those needs. And so it makes it really difficult. I actually, when I started giving this presentation to teachers, I actually got the most response that I've ever gotten back around this sort of like relief that, these kids don't hate me, or, it's not that there's this personal thing. It really is that some of these brains are really struggling and they're operating in this primal place. Sometimes, and we'll see it, right? Like a kid will come in, they'll put their head down on the desk first thing in the morning. The teacher will come up and ask them how they're doing, and they just grunt or they don't say anything. And, they're a piece of paper is put in front of them, and you ask them to put their name on it, and they blow up all of a sudden. They're like, whoa, where did that come from? It's because they walked in the door at a -5, right? And now they're at a 5, and now they're at a 6, right? And it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because the rational part of the brain isn't working, right? The primal survival part of the brain is working. I think subs have a really interesting time. My wife actually substitutes a lot, and she and I talk about it quite a bit. It's hard to come into a space that maybe there is a lot of safety, or maybe there hasn't been a lot of safety in the classroom. And so how you're navigating that when you have very little relationship, is really about your presence and how you're presenting yourselves, the types of words that you're using when you're, um, sort of, are you using a more authoritarian approach because you think that the rules are going to work? And when they do, it's great. You don't have to worry, right? Like, if you mess with me, I'm going to send you to the office, right? And that sort of keeps people cowed and calm, but it doesn't feel safe. Although sometimes it can feel safe, because people following the rules then feels like it's safe. But I could talk about this stuff for hours. So yeah, so that how we approach our relationships with kids really comes down to the core of reducing that reaction, giving us more space from that brain feeling like it's going 0 to 10, being able to intervene early, being able to know when a kid are we seeing freeze or submit? And let's be clear, like when we talk about school violence or we talk about violence with kids, it's always like that kid was always so quiet. They never said anything. They always seemed so nice. I never would have thought that that person would have done that thing, right? It's because we don't notice. The whole point of freeze and submit is that we don't notice that they're dysregulated all the time. So you could have a kid sitting there at a -6 day in and day out, and you might not know until they go to a +6 and it escalates up, right? And harm is possible when you aren't humanizing, when you don't have the ability to see somebody as a human, including ourselves, right? Self-harm comes when we're so dysregulated that we don't see ourselves as human. And then violence towards others is again that you're so dysregulated that you aren't seeing that that is someone that you're harming. So it's really powerful on those sides, and it really does come down to that survival brain.
Bear, we thank you so much for joining us for the time and condensing that into our office hours. I know already we're going to talk to our team about having you come back and do a part 2 of this because it was so fantastic. I am going to share a couple of slides. I know if you guys need to leave right at 4 o'clock, that's totally fine, but I'm going to have Carly, will you drop our link to the contact hour in the chat, Carly? Let me share this real quick. So there's just a few resources we go over. Like I said, if anybody has to go, that's totally fine. But I want to make sure we get these out for our recording. Let's see, share back here. Current slide. There we go. All right, you guys seeing the right slide there?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. All right, so this is Bear's information for if you want to reach out to him. This is the website and his email address, so you can contact him there. The links all work in our PowerPoints too, you guys, if you have access to those. And Bear dropped his info in the chat too, so thank you for doing that. And now if you've come to any of our office hours before, we always share these resources, and I'll zip through them just in the interest of time. We have our special ed law page that has MUSER, procedural safeguards, and the procedural manual, all great resources. This is our supervision monitoring and support page that has links to our professional learning, our resources, our team schedule, things like that. Let's see, and we don't link the direct documents anymore because our website changes so frequently that it gets very frustrating. So we link the homepage here. More resources for if you're writing IEPs. There's lots of resources on here for that. We record all of our office hours and other trainings that we do, and they are all linked right here on our professional learning page. You can sort them by viewing more recordings and by heading to see what we have to offer there. Here is the rest of our PD schedule for the rest of the school year. We're in halfway through there. We go till May. You can register using these links. And one more page with IEP and related form resources. And lastly is the QR code and link to our feedback form for this training. If you select office hours, I think it's the title of this office hours, you'll get a contact hour for joining us today, as well as some other goodies that will come to you. And that link is directly in the chat too. And we thank you guys so much for joining us. You can find us all on the DOE social medias here and our contact information if you guys have any other questions after this. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Bear.